On my son's wedding day, 500 guests watched as my in-laws pointed at me and laughed. They called me a burden. They called me the trash of humanity. In their eyes, I was just a bankrupt old man in a cheap suit, someone lucky enough merely to breathe the same air as them. My daughter-in-law stood there in her $50,000 gown, laughing the loudest of all. She believed my son had won the lottery by marrying her. But the moment I stood up and walked out was the moment they unknowingly stepped into the greatest tragedy of their lives, one they themselves had set in motion. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, a few snacks, sit back comfortably. And remember this, the people in these stories always had every chance to act with decency. They simply chose not to. Leave a comment and tell me the city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story has traveled across the world. The smell of leftover food and the heat spilling from the kitchen door behind me were thick in the air. In the grand ballroom of the Grand Hotel, the Sterling family had seated me at table 44, the place reserved for the forgotten. The crystal chandeliers above sparkled brilliantly, but to me they only illuminated the layer of hypocrisy covering the entire room. The diamonds around Catherine Sterling's neck glittered like shards of glass, cold and sharp. I sat there with my thin hands clasped together. My old suit looked painfully out of place among the glossy Italian tuxedos worn by the self-proclaimed elite garments that fit them like a second skin. I looked at my son Darius. He stood on the stage, his face pale with humiliation, humiliated by the very woman he was about to marry. Rowan approached my table. The sharp clicks of her heels against the marble floor sounded like a blade being sharpened on stone. She didn't look at me the way someone looks at a father-in-law. She looked at me the way someone looks at a stain on the floor that needs to be swept away. Leaning close, her expensive perfume almost suffocating, she whispered that my presence was ruining her perfect wedding photographs. The laughter of the Sterling family erupted. It was not the sound of joy. It was the sound of a guillotine blade, falling, cutting away what little dignity they believed I had left. Devlin Sterling, her father, raised a glass of red wine worth thousands of dollars in my direction. He declared that the noble blood of the Sterling family could not be tainted by an unemployed man from the suburbs. Darius was about to speak up to defend me, but I placed a hand on his shoulder. The pain of watching my son being humiliated spread through my chest, yet I did not let it show on my face. Real power is like gravity. You do not need to shout to prove it exists. You simply stand still and let everything collapse according to its own laws. What would you do if you and your family were treated with contempt and trampled on? Like this video and comment number 1 to stand with the poor and the powerless. My patience had run out. I looked Devlin straight in the eye. He saw a pitiful old man, but he did not see the financial monster he had just awakened. I stood up. The plastic chair scraped harshly across the floor. I said nothing to them. I simply walked out into the darkness, waiting outside. Darius hurried after me, leaving the arrogant bride behind with her father. I knew he had made his decision as well. I pulled my old phone from my jacket pocket. My finger moved across the screen. It was time for the Sterling family to learn the price of arrogance. I pressed the call button for my assistant. The line was answered immediately. My voice was no longer the voice of a weak old father. It was cold and sharp, like an execution order. I instructed them to carry out the first step. In less than 10 minutes, the entire financial network supporting the proud Sterling name would begin to crack. I stood beneath the streetlight and looked back at the ballroom one last time. Tonight they would learn that sometimes a man in a dirty work jacket can carry the heart of a king. The engine of the old battered car groaned along the dirt road leading back to the outskirts. Darius sat behind the wheel, his hands gripping it so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The silence between father and son was thick as lead. I glanced at his face. A single tear rolled down his cheek and vanished into the darkness. He had just walked away from the woman he loved at the altar. He had thrown away his pride to stand beside the old father the world had just mocked. I could feel his pain. It was an open wound, raw, burning, and deep. The Sterling family had not only humiliated me, they had used Darius's love as a weapon to crush his dignity. Rowan, the woman he intended to spend his life with, had stood there looking at him with a curled lip, as if she knew my son could never truly leave her, and if he did, she would simply discard him like a toy that had lost its value. Every one of those glances and gestures had been noticed by this old man. What she did not know was that she had just awakened the devil inside me. We stopped in front of the old wooden house. The rotting boards and moss-covered roof looked miserable beneath the moonlight. This was the place the Sterling family believed I was waiting to die in poverty. Darius stepped out of the car, his shoulders heavy with the weight of failure. He looked at the house, then at me. He apologized for letting me endure those humiliations. He said we would start again even if we had nothing but our bare hands. I said nothing. I simply walked beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. I led him through the dusty living room and toward the dark corner of the kitchen. There, behind an old worn cabinet of dishes, was a perfectly concealed steel door. I placed my hand on the hidden biometric sensor. A hydraulic hiss shattered the silence. The door opened, revealing a staircase descending into the earth. Darius froze. He looked at me as if I were a stranger. We walked down. Blinding white light from the automatic LED system came alive, pushing back the darkness. The underground chamber carried none of the damp smell of soil. It was a modern command center with 12 massive data screens glowing with streams of bright green code. This was the heart of Bennett Global Holdings. This was where I directed rivers of money flowing across the world while still wearing a faded work jacket. I stood before the screens. Their light reflected in my eyes, cold and commanding. I was no longer the old man at table 44. I was the one controlling the board. Darius stood motionless, unable to blink, like the moment he first came into this world, when everything around him was beyond his imagination. He stared at the numbers dancing across the screens and stammered, asking what all of this was. I looked at my son. My voice was calm, steady, and powerful. I told him that real wealth is silent. Real wealth is hidden power. And most importantly, real wealth is patience. I had waited a long time for this moment, not to show off, but to teach my son the true value of a human being. I asked my assistant Thorne to appear on the main screen. His sharp-featured face appeared instantly, bowing his head with absolute respect. I gave the order. Every debt Darius had ever carried vanished in a single moment. But that was only the beginning. Next, I ordered the immediate freeze of every credit card belonging to the Sterling family. The powerful black cards Rowan and her father used to purchase their luxury would become useless pieces of plastic tonight. I wanted them to feel what it meant to stand at the peak with not a single dollar left in their pockets. My revenge was not an outburst of anger. It was a precise algorithm, cold, calculated, and irreversible. Tonight, the Sterling family would begin to learn what it means when an empire built on arrogance starts to collapse. Darius stood frozen in the middle of the room. His eyes were wide, reflecting the blue light from the financial charts dancing endlessly across the screens. He looked at me, then at the 12 massive monitors surrounding us. The silence in this underground chamber was nothing like the quiet of the wooden house above. It was the silence of a storm gathering energy, a silence filled with authority and immense value. I walked toward the main control console. Each step across the metal floor echoed sharply. I no longer felt the pain from the insults at the wedding. Those emotions had been compressed, transformed into a cold fuel that powered this machine. I looked at the central screen where the asset structure of the Sterling Empire was displayed. It looked like a sandcastle, waiting for a single powerful wave to wash it away. Darius stepped closer, his voice trembling. He asked why I had hidden all of this from him for so many years. Why we had lived in apparent poverty while owning an empire like this. I turned and looked at him. The white light from the ceiling illuminated the lines on my face. I told him that I wanted him to understand the true value of a human being. I wanted him to grow into a man who understood hardship, who respected the struggles of others, and who knew his own worth. Real life is not measured by the balance in a bank account. When you have too much of it, the numbers lose their meaning. I wanted him to learn how to see beyond the surface of people, to find someone who would truly love him for who he was. Then I explained my philosophy. Real wealth must remain quiet. Those who truly hold power never need to shout to the world about who they are. Only hollow people cover their emptiness with diamonds and expensive clothes. Wealth is power, and the greatest power of all is patience. I had been patient long enough to see the true nature of many people, including the Sterling family, but that was something he would understand fully in time. For now, I needed to restore the honor that had been taken from both of us and teach those people a lesson about humility. I ordered Thorne to begin Phase 2 of the plan. The commands were executed instantly. I wanted Darius to witness the power that comes from holding the financial lifelines of your enemies. I instructed him to freeze every credit line belonging to the Sterling family. At this very moment, Rowan was probably dreaming about a luxurious honeymoon, one she planned to enjoy without the poor groom. Perhaps she even believed there were many wealthy replacements waiting for her. But soon she would discover that her powerful black card would be declined at every payment counter. That was the first warning. Darius stared at the screen as the words, "Executed," appeared in glowing red letters. He was beginning to understand. He was no longer the young man abandoned by his fiancée. He was standing beside a man capable of shifting the balance of entire markets with a single touch. I told him that from this moment on he would never have to bow his head to anyone again. But power always comes with responsibility. I wanted him to use this strength to punish arrogance, not to become someone like Devlin and his daughter. The financial strategy I was using was like surgery without a blade. We were cutting off the oxygen supply to the Sterling businesses. Every subsidiary, every real estate project they owned, was built on layers of debt, and I happened to be the final holder of those obligations. Their collapse would not happen loudly at once. It would begin with tiny fractures spreading slowly until the entire structure crushed itself under its own weight. I placed a hand on Darius's shoulder and told him to get some rest. Tomorrow would be a long day. The real war had only just begun. The Sterling family believed they had won when they drove me out of that wedding reception. What they did not realize was that in doing so, they had signed the death warrant for their own empire. I remained alone in the underground command room, staring at the screen displaying the image of the Sterling mansion. A faint smile appeared on my lips. Tonight they would still sleep on silk sheets. But it would be the last night of their false peace. Real power had awakened and it knew no mercy. The next morning, the air in the underground chamber was filled with the scent of coffee and determination. Darius stood before the large screen, and his eyes no longer carried the exhaustion of a betrayed man. He was staring at the bright red numbers, signaling the falling stock value of the Sterling Corporation. I stood behind him, my hands in the pockets of my old jacket, quietly watching the transformation in my son. I stepped forward and placed my hand on the control panel. I told Darius that revenge is not an outburst of anger. Revenge is the art of precision. The Sterling family used humiliation to attack us. Now we will use truth to answer them. I showed him the list of Devlin's creditors. More than 70% of them were shell companies owned by me. Darius asked about the next step. I smiled a smile without warmth. I told him that when your enemy is making mistakes, never interrupt them. Give them a bigger shovel so they can dig their own grave. Devlin Sterling is an arrogant man. He has always believed that appearances and glamorous connections could save him. Soon he will realize that those relationships are nothing more than ropes tightening around his own neck. I explained to Darius the nature of hidden power. It is not like the bright stage lights at the Grand Hotel. It is like a deep ocean current, silent but capable of sinking any ship that drifts into its path. I spent my entire life building this network. I lived like a ghost inside my own empire, just to ensure that when I finally stepped forward, everything would already be decided. Darius looked at me with a new kind of respect. He was beginning to understand that the cheap suit I wore yesterday was not a sign of failure. It was a test for the arrogant. The Sterling family failed that test miserably. Rowan chose a $50,000 dress over loyalty. Her father chose contempt over kindness. Now they would pay with the very things they valued most: money and reputation. I pressed a command key. Thorne appeared on the screen and reported that Sterling's partner banks had already begun demanding early repayment of their loans. Panic was spreading through Devlin's offices. I looked at my son and told him this was only the opening act. We would not simply take their money. We would expose their true faces to the entire world. If you believe integrity is the greatest currency, press the like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who judged only your appearance? I want to hear your story of victory. This revenge is not only for me. It is for Darius's late mother, who always believed in humility. It is for the years we lived simply to protect an enormous secret. I looked at the final data screen. A massive short-selling order had just been activated. Tonight the Sterling castle will begin to shake, and I will be the last man standing to watch it collapse completely. The glow from the screens in the underground room cast pale blue streaks across Darius's face. On the large display, Rowan Sterling was hosting a live broadcast. She sat in a room covered with roses, her eyes red with carefully staged tears. She was sobbing to thousands of viewers about how Darius had abused her and abandoned her at the altar. She played the role of a helpless victim, crushed by a poor and rough man. Darius clenched his fists. The veins on his hands stood out sharply. He wanted to run out there to shout to the world that she was a liar. I placed a cold hand on his shoulder and told him to stay calm. Emotion is the enemy of clarity. When your enemy is making mistakes, never interrupt them. Give them a bigger shovel so they can dig their own grave. Rowan was digging a deep pit with her own lies. She believed social media was her greatest weapon. She believed the crowd would shield her from the truth. But she did not know that I owned the very platform she was using to spread those poisonous words. I instructed Thorne to prepare a special gift for her live stream. A naked truth that would shatter her angelic mask in front of the entire public. I looked at Rowan's face on the screen. Her hypocrisy disgusted me. She spoke about her $50,000 wedding dress as if it were a burden she had personally carried. She described my family's poverty as if it were a contagious disease. I thought quietly about what was about to happen. Revenge does not need noise. It only needs absolute precision. Darius asked why we did not release the evidence immediately. I looked at him, my gaze sharp as a blade. I told him that waiting is part of the punishment. We would let her climb to the peak of her arrogance. Let her collect sympathy and donations from gullible followers. And the moment she believed she had won, we would remove the ground beneath her feet. Financial engineering and control of information were two swords I had forged over decades. The Sterling family had grown used to using money to bury the truth. They believed everything had a price. But they had forgotten one thing. Some things cannot be bought with money, integrity, and truth. Tonight I would show them the power of a truth revealed at the perfect moment. If you believe integrity is the greatest currency, press the like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who judged you only by appearances? I want to hear your story of victory. I ordered Thorne to access the Grand Hotel security cameras from the night before. I wanted every angle of the moment Rowan humiliated me. I wanted the world to see her laughing at another person's pain. Her live stream would soon turn into a public verdict. The game had only just reached its most dramatic stage. I looked at Darius. The anger in his eyes was slowly being replaced by the cold discipline he needed. He was learning what it meant to be a man of the Bennett family. Someone who never bows to injustice. Someone who understands that sometimes justice needs a small push from the shadows. We stood there in the modern underground command center, preparing the first devastating strike against the honor of the Sterling family, a blow they would never recover from. If you have listened this far, and want stories like this to keep coming, it truly helps if you press the like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it is what keeps this entire channel alive. My hand slid across the touch panel. A red notification appeared. Catherine Sterling had just been admitted to St. Jude Hospital. Devlin Sterling immediately organized an emergency press conference in the hospital lobby. He appeared with a sorrowful face and tearful eyes. He accused my family of shocking his wife into a stroke with our cruelty. He called us invisible killers. I watched the screen and allowed myself a faint smile. A clumsy script. The Sterling family had always believed hospitals were temples of lies they could buy. I turned to Thorne and asked about the ownership structure of St. Jude. Thorne replied in his calm, mechanical voice. The hospital carried a massive loan from an investment fund in Singapore, a fund secretly under my control. I ordered Thorne to purchase the entire hospital debt within 1 hour. I wanted absolute control. Every camera and every medical record needed to be under my authority. Darius stared at me in disbelief. He could not imagine a hospital of that scale changing hands so quickly. I told him money can build walls, but ultimate power can tear them down with a single signature. While Devlin continued speaking dramatically to the cameras about his daughter's devotion and his wife's critical condition, I accessed the VIP room security system. The image that appeared made Darius gasp in disgust. Catherine Sterling was not lying in a hospital bed with breathing tubes. She was dancing to loud music. In her hand was an expensive glass of red wine. Rowan stood beside her. Mother and daughter were raising their glasses, celebrating the success of their victim performance. I took a slow breath. It was time to end the act. I ordered Thorne to broadcast the footage onto every large screen in the hospital lobby directly behind Devlin while he continued his emotional speech. The images and sound filled the hall instantly. For a single second the reporters fell silent. Then the room exploded with whispers and flashes of cameras. Devlin turned around. His face changed from red to pale white, then to a lifeless gray. He saw his wife laughing and drinking on the screen. He saw his lie exposed in the most humiliating way possible before the entire world. He tried to block the screens, but it was far too late. The truth had already spread like a virus that could not be contained. If you believe integrity is the greatest currency, press the like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who judged you only by appearances? I want to hear your victory story. I stood in the underground chamber watching the fall of the Sterling family through the screens. I felt no joy, only a cold sense of peace. Justice is not something that simply appears. Sometimes you have to create it yourself. The Sterling family had always looked down on those they believed were beneath them. They thought they could manipulate truth like a puppet on strings. But today they learned that those strings can turn into a noose if arrogance pulls them too tight. The incident at the hospital was only a strike against their honor. The next strike would threaten their survival. I looked at Darius and saw him nod slowly. He was beginning to understand how the world truly works. A world where truth always carries a price. And I was the one who decided what that price would be. 1 week later, Devlin Sterling looked like a wounded beast thrashing in the mud. His attempts to salvage his reputation at the hospital had failed miserably. The Sterling Corporation stock was in freefall. He needed a lifeline. He needed new investors to pump blood back into the dry corpse of his empire. I knew exactly where he would appear next. The Pine Ridge Golf Club, where million-dollar deals were signed between stretches of perfect green grass. I arrived an hour before he did. I was not wearing a tuxedo or a luxury polo shirt. I wore my worn work jacket and faded jeans. I stood at the edge of the course leaning against an old oak tree watching the wealthy men walk past. They looked polished under the bright sun. But beneath their designer clothes lived nothing but worry and calculation. Devlin arrived with 3 potential investors. He tried to maintain his usual calm composure. He spoke confidently about future projects. But the moment his eyes landed on me, that confidence turned into pure fury. He walked toward me, abandoning the men beside him. He looked me up and down with his familiar contempt. He called me a golf club thief. He told me to get out of his sight before he called security. I said nothing. I simply looked back at him with quiet eyes. He shouted that a bankrupt old man like me had no right to breathe the air here. He turned to the investors and used me as an example of society's decay. He thought humiliating me would prove his superiority. He had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor. The golf club manager came running toward us out of breath. Devlin smirked and ordered him to throw me out immediately. But what happened next froze everyone present. The manager did not look at Devlin. Instead, he bowed deeply to me. He addressed me as chairman and announced that the entire land area, including the club and the surrounding golf courses, had officially become my property 15 minutes earlier. Silence spread across the golf course. The wind moved through the trees, but no one dared to move. Devlin's face changed in a strange way. Words stumbled out of his mouth without forming sentences. The investors beside him began stepping away. They realized they were standing next to a man who had just insulted the most powerful person in the room. He had only seen the clothes. He had never seen the man. I stepped closer to Devlin until only a few inches separated us. I could see the sweat running down his temple. I told him that power is not found in membership cards or custom-tailored suits. Power lies in who owns the ground beneath another man's feet. Then I ordered the manager to remove Devlin from the club immediately. I did not want his presence on my property for even 1 more second. Security escorted him away in front of the investors. He tried shouting about his projects, but nobody cared anymore. Those investors were vultures. They knew exactly when to abandon a dying carcass. I watched Devlin being dragged across the perfect green grass. He had lost everything: his reputation, his money, and now his final shred of pride. I sat down on a wooden bench near the course and asked for a simple glass of water. Darius walked over and stood beside me. He had witnessed everything. He understood now that the bitterest revenge is not violence. The bitterest revenge is taking away everything your enemy takes pride in and leaving them alone with the emptiness they created. We stood there on land that now belonged to us, watching the Sterling Empire collapse piece by piece. Tonight, Devlin Sterling would finally understand something. Clothes can change, but the nature of a king never disappears. My office at Bennett Global was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. Rowan Sterling walked in without the arrogance of a wealthy heiress. Her expensive dress now looked wrinkled and out of place. She dropped to her knees in front of me. Carefully painted tears ran down her face as she sobbed and admitted she had been wrong. Then she made her final claim. She said she was pregnant with Darius's child. Rowan asked for $500,000 to keep the secret and disappear quietly. She believed the unborn child was her last shield to blackmail us. She thought a false display of motherhood could soften a father like me. I looked down at her. My gaze was as cold as a frozen lake in winter. I did not see a future mother. I saw a con artist trying to gather the last scraps from a sinking ship. Slowly, I pulled a brown file from my desk drawer and slid it across the table. Rowan's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a DNA test report stamped in red from the most respected laboratory in the city. I calmly told her she had been careless when she left her hairbrush in our old wooden house. The strands of hair she left behind had revealed the truth. The child was not Darius's. The father was the personal trainer she had been secretly seeing just days before the wedding. Rowan froze. Her face twisted with pure terror. Her final lie had been torn apart in the most brutal way possible. I told her something quietly. Hatred consumes too much energy. I no longer hated her. I only felt pity for a soul that sold its honor for glittering things that were never truly hers. At that moment, Darius walked into the office. He looked at the woman who had once been his fiancée with completely unfamiliar eyes. There was no anger left in them. No pain either. Only distance. He spoke a single sentence. Her presence was polluting the air in the room. Then he asked security to escort her out. Rowan screamed and begged for forgiveness, but the heavy oak doors closed behind her with a final echo. The greatest punishment for greed is realizing you traded a true treasure for a pile of shining trash. The Sterling family had built their lives on lies. Now the foundation had collapsed completely. I looked at Darius and saw maturity in his eyes. He had learned how to recognize the difference between real gold and something merely plated. Every piece on the board was now in its place. Rowan's lies would soon reach the courts and the newspapers. The Sterling family had no path left to escape. They had tried to use an innocent child to carry out their scheme. That was the final line they should never have crossed. I stood by the window watching the city lights come alive. Tonight justice would be completed. And tomorrow a new chapter would begin for the Bennett family. A chapter without betrayal. If you have followed the story all the way to this point, please take a moment to subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs nothing and means a great deal to the channel. The fall of the Sterling family did not begin with a loud explosion. It began with a deadly silence inside their corporate boardroom. I stood at the head of the table. The worn work jacket I once wore had been replaced by a black suit. It was not flashy, but it carried the quiet authority of a king who had returned to his throne. Devlin sat across from me. The arrogance he once displayed on the golf course was gone. He looked 10 years older. His dull eyes stared at the bankruptcy notice lying on the table. Every asset belonging to the Sterling family had been frozen. Their grand mansion had been sealed. Their luxury cars had been towed away. I had purchased all of it. Every piece of land. Every remaining share. I did not buy them to own them. I bought them to erase the Sterling name from the business map of this city. I told Devlin that his greatest mistake was not financial failure. His greatest mistake was believing he could step on other people without ever paying the price. Rowan stood in the corner of the room. She no longer wore her $50,000 gown. Instead, she had on a cheap shirt hurriedly bought from a convenience store. The DNA test had spread across every newspaper. She was no longer simply bankrupt. She had become a symbol of betrayal and deception. I looked at her and saw a broken soul. The artificial wealth she once worshipped had vanished like smoke. Darius stepped forward. He placed one final file in front of Devlin. It was an arrest warrant for financial fraud and tax evasion. The evidence Thorne gathered over the past week was more than enough to send Devlin to prison for decades. Devlin's hand trembled as he picked up the pen. He had no choice but to sign the transfer of everything that remained. Then he looked at me and asked why I had taken things this far. I leaned down slightly. My voice was calm but sharp, like a sentence being passed. I told him I did it for every old man he had ever looked down on. I did it for my son. And most importantly, I did it for the integrity of this world. You cannot build an empire on the suffering of others and expect it to last forever. When arrogance is your foundation, collapse is only a matter of time. If you believe integrity is the greatest currency, press the like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who judged only your appearance? I want to hear your story of victory. The police entered the room. The metallic sound of handcuffs clicking together echoed sharply. It was the sound of an era of lies coming to an end. Devlin was escorted away. Rowan collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I did not look back. Darius and I walked out of the building named Sterling for the final time. Tomorrow that name would disappear. In its place would stand a children's foundation named after my late wife. The revenge was complete. But redemption had only just begun. I took a deep breath of the open air. We had reclaimed justice with our own hands. Everything ended in the quiet I had always hoped for. I sat on the porch of the old wooden house. There were no crystal chandeliers or artificial symphonies here. Only the wind moving through the trees and the smell of earth after the rain. In my hand was a $5 cup of roadside coffee. Its bitterness was honest. It tasted better than any expensive wine I had ever been served at the Sterling family parties. The Sterling mansion now belonged to the past. Workers were removing the shiny brass nameplate from the front gate. By my order, the estate would soon become a children's foundation named after my wife. Devlin was now staring at gray prison walls. Rowan was working as a waitress in a small town, forced to smile at strangers for loose coins. The most fitting punishment is making someone live the life they once mocked. Darius stepped onto the porch and sat beside me. He looked peaceful. He wore no designer clothes, only a simple shirt. He stared toward the horizon and said that he finally understood why I had chosen to live quietly for so many years. Power is not meant for display. Power exists to protect what you love and to deliver justice when the moment demands it. The storm had changed him. He was no longer the young man blinded by love. I looked at my son and smiled. I told him never to let anyone measure his worth by the size of his wallet. A tailored suit can hide a monster, and a worn work jacket can hold a king. This world is full of people who judge only appearances. They are like the Sterlings. They see the shell but never the soul. But people like us understand that integrity is the finest suit a person can ever wear. We had taken everything back. Not only money but our honor. This revenge left no hatred in my heart. It left a lesson about patience. I lived like a poor man to teach my son compassion, and when the time came I acted like a king to teach him the power of truth. The coffee in my hand had gone cold, but the warmth of freedom still filled my chest. If you have listened this far, I know you value integrity and the kind of strength that comes from within. If that speaks to you, press the like button and subscribe so you do not miss more stories like this. The sun began to set, painting the fields in deep red light. I knew that tomorrow we would begin a new journey. A journey where the name Bennett would stand for kindness instead of arrogance. I set the coffee cup down and stood up. The evening wind grew colder, yet I felt strangely warm. At last I could smile toward the memory of my late wife. I had kept my promise to her. I had protected our son and taught him how to become a true man. We walked back into the house, leaving the darkness of the past behind and stepping into the light of an honest future.